back to another exciting episode here at IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Wes Bryan, and in today's episode, we're continuing through our series within the VMware Certified Professional version 6. We're moving into new territory, and that is vSphere networking, and we're looking at configuring vSwitches today. Joining me back in the studios is none other than Mr. Don Pizzette. Don, how you doing, sir?
I am doing swell, ready to jump right back into vSphere 6, and like Wes said in this episode, we're going to be looking at networking. So we really haven't touched networking very much so far, and we kind of need to. I want to start off basic with vSwitches, and so we're going to run through that here, but know that in real life land, the majority of the time we're actually going to do what are called distributed vSwitches. But before we can talk about distributing them, we kind of need to understand what a vSwitch is in the first place, and so we're going to get a chance to see that. Now, in a lot of third-party virtualization products, in products like Citrix Zen Server or Microsoft's Hyper-V and other products, when you create a virtual machine, you attach the network adapter of that virtual machine to a physical adapter, and that creates the network, and off you go. VMware actually gives us a little bit more power than that. Inside of vSphere, especially inside of the ESXi host, we can create virtual switches. So not just attaching a physical adapter to a VM, but actually creating a virtual switch that has all the capabilities of a physical switch right here inside of a virtualization environment. And that opens us up to a lot of power. It gives us some really cool things that we can do. In fact, when we get into the distributed side, you'll see where we can even yank out VMware's switch, and we can pop in like Cisco's 1000 series switch, where it's a completely virtualized Cisco switch that's in the background. And now you got tons of power that you can use. It's really impressive stuff. It doesn't have to be complex. It can be very simple if that's what you want. It can be very complex, but the point is, it's all done in software. It's all software-defined networking, SDN. And what that basically means for us, what we care about, is if I have one virtual switch or 100 virtual switches, it doesn't cost me any extra money. So if I want an extremely complex network, I have that power. I can do it. If I want to keep it simple, I can. All right. So that's what we're going to run through here, is a chance to see how to create those networks and see how complex we can make it. You
know, Don, and some of the other vendors, and I know this is not another vendor show, we have different types of virtual switches we can create, you know, whether it's VirtualBox, something like Hyper-V, right? And it depends on the type of communication that you need and where that communication has to happen that dictates which type of switch you make. Do we have different types of communications here?
Not really, because the way VMware approaches it is different, because they approach it like real switches. So if I want a virtual machine to be isolated from everybody else, I plug it into its own switch, just like I would in real life. Don't plug it into the switch with everybody else. If you don't want it to see everybody else, move it off. Or maybe I want it on its own VLAN, so I define a VLAN and move it off to that. You can do that. You treat your virtual switches just like you would real switches, right? The other vendors, they like to say, oh, this is an isolated port, or this is a host-only port, or this is a external port. A port's a port to Cisco. It's just a switch port. And what cables you plug in, what virtual cables you plug in, is what's going to define what you can gain access to. All right. Let's take a look at what we have by default. Now, a vSwitch by default exists on a single ESXi host. So every ESXi host you create has one vSwitch by default. It's made during the install because that's how we access the management interface. If I go into vCenter and I go into my, actually, let me go back to the home here. I need to go to hosts and clusters. And I'm going to pick one of my hosts. I'll take ESX host 02. This is a system that I installed ESX on it, and that's it. I did just the default install. I set a password, and then I added it to vCenter. So I have not customized the configuration of this server beyond just getting it attached to vCenter. And so if I go under Manage and Networking, I can see that there's been a virtual switch created for me called vSwitch 0. All right, so vSwitch 0 is the default vSwitch that it made for me. And if I look at the configuration, it shows me a nice little picture. So we don't have to read, which is nice. But what you basically have is one switch that has two ports in it. And those two ports are linked. See that little orange line right there letting me know that they're linked together. And I've got my physical adapter plugged in. So I've got a physical network adapter on my machine. And I've got the virtual network adapter for this interface. And this interface is my management network. This is what's letting me get to the virtual management interface for ESX. So it has to set that up, otherwise I can't connect to the server. I don't have any virtual machines on this host, but if I did, the default for a virtual machine would be to end up right here on this VM network. Okay, so the VM network is created, but if you look at the cabling, it's the same switch, and it runs to the same port over here these are effectively the same. It's one switch. If I plug my management network, my VM, and my physical adapter all into the same switch, they can all see each other. And that may be what you want. That may be the exact configuration you want, or it may not. One of the big problems you're going to bump into here is that your virtual machine is on the same network as your management network. So that means that if I fire up a VM, it can just browse and access the management network. I may not want that. I may not want them to be able to get to the vCenter web console or whatever, right? So in that scenario, I might want to split these up. There's a few ways you can do that. If you have more than one physical adapter, you can define that in the network. You can create additional switches. You can create additional connections for them and define that out. Let me jump over to my other server. My other server does have a virtual machine. So I have a virtual machine called Web01 on it. It's just a Linux web server that's fired up. And so if I take a look at its networking, it looks the same. It's that same default switch, except it actually has one virtual machine right here. So see how I have a green port? On the other one, this was empty because I had no VMs. Well, I could make this one empty too. If I shut that web server down, for example, so I'm just going to take it and we'll power it off. So I'm going to power that thing off. When you turn that virtual machine off, it's powered down. So think about a physical switch. What would happen on a physical switch if you powered a host down? The link light goes off, right? The link light doesn't stay on when the machine is off. Well, I guess it could have a wake on LAN adapter, in which case the link light might stay on. But in this case, if I go back to my networking, what I'm going to see is that green light is gone, right? It's no longer plugged in. I do have a virtual machine. It's just not on, and there's its port, and it's gray because the machine is off. We don't have wake on LAN support for it. So if I power it back on, it'll be there. But I can also change what it's plugged into. So if let me power this thing back on. So I'm going to power it on. And if I look right here at its settings, I've got network adapter, and it shows that it's plugged into VM network. And it said disconnected, but then when I powered it on, now it says connected. So it shows that it is plugged into that network. And you can tweak and change that if you want. You can connect it to different networks, but I've only got one network. So what if I want to isolate it? If I want to isolate it, I can create more networks. Now, back in my host, if I go under my, my network, you'll see I've got several different things along the left side here, right? Virtual switches, that's what we've been talking about so far. These are just like physical switches, except they're here and they're fake. Right after it, I have VM kernel adapters. What are those? Well, VM kernel adapters, those are the network adapters that are used for the management processes inside of VMware. These are things like the management interface, right? This is a VM kernel adapter right here, and it says it, VM kernel ports 1. Versus down here, where these are virtual machines, here it's a VM kernel port. So this is talking about the actual VM visor kernel and the way we interact with it. Things like vMotion and Heartbeat and so on, those can all use these VM kernel adapters too. Then we've got physical adapters. Well, like the name implies, these are the actual network adapters in our server. You may have one or more of these adapters. When I take a look at mine, you see I actually have 2 adapters, right? I have 2 gig adapters that are showing up as Intel 82545EM blah, blah, blah copper adapters, right? One is attached to vSwitch 0, the other one's not attached to anything. It's just sitting there, I'm not using it, right? I can create another switch and attach it to this adapter, or I could attach this adapter to my first switch. You can have more than one adapter on a switch. It's actually kind of neat. I'll show you why here in just a minute. Then we've got our TCP/IP configuration. Well, the virtual switches don't have IP addresses. So when you look in here, what it's really talking about is just the default gateway that's being handed out in the event that we set up DHCP on these switches. You can actually be your own DHCP server on the switch to issue out addresses. I'm not doing that here, but you can certainly do that. And then last we have our advanced settings where you can tweak things like IPv6 support and direct path I/O if your hardware supports it. With direct path, you might have more than one way to get to a destination, and when the virtual machine reaches out to the hardware network adapter, it can actually provide direct hardware access to that network adapter, direct path, input and output, if your hardware supports it. Mine does not. All right, so if I go back to my virtual switches, this virtual switch just has one physical network adapter, and that's it, okay? I can add more than one physical network adapter, and there's a few reasons why I might want to do it. The 2 primary reasons are performance and redundancy. Okay, performance. If I had more than one network adapter, I can bond them together, and I get improved performance. I get faster speeds. If I have just one adapter, I'm limited to the speed of that one adapter. If I have 2, I can increase. If I have just one adapter, what happens if that adapter fails? All those VMs just got cut off from the network. If I have two adapters, now one can fail and the other's still running, right? So I can define additional network adapters on these things and have some kind of fun with it, right? So if I want to tweak that, I certainly can. All we have to do is edit our vSwitch. And so I can take this vSwitch, and you'll see you got a few different buttons up here, like this one, which says manage the physical network adapters connected to the switch, versus just straight up edit. If I go to straight up edit that switch, you'll see I don't have a whole lot of options in here pertaining to the physical adapters. I can see that it's got an MTU size, right, maximum transmission unit. I've got my security settings we saw back in the, what episode was that? In some episode, we covered that already, where we can tweak the security. Oh, it was hardening the ESXi host, where we covered that. I see traffic shaping, where I can restrict the bandwidth, and I see teaming and failover. Ooh, now we're talking. Now we're talking about physical adapters, right? Here's where I can set up teaming, where I bond two adapters together to get increased bandwidth, or failover. If one fails, the other takes over. Well, I see VMNIC 0, that's my first adapter. Where's my other adapter? Well, the other adapter is not attached to this switch yet, and so it doesn't show up. So this is where I want to go to configure it, but I need to get that other adapter in there, and that's why I pointed out the other button, the button up here that says manage the physical network adapters. Because what you have to do is you have to go in and define which adapters are attached to that switch, and right now, I've only got one. Now, I've got to choose how I want to set this up. If I'm trying to get performance, I need two adapters that are both active at the same time so I can move data over both. If I'm just trying to get redundancy, I need one adapter active and the other one in standby. So if the first one fails, the other one kick in. But as long as the first one is running, the second one just sits there and waits. Now, I'll be honest with you guys, most people don't set that up because if you could have both adapters running, you could double your bandwidth, you might as well do it. And if one fails, your bandwidth goes down, but you stay up and online. So it's rare that we do a standby type adapter solution, but you certainly could. When I go to add in an adapter, I can add it in, and there it shows that VMNIC 1. That's my second adapter that I can pick, and I can pick where it's going to go. Do I want it to be active, standby, or unused, right? And so I can come in and put it, maybe I want it to be standby, maybe I want it to be active, and I can attach it. And when I attach it, it's just going to show me the additional properties of that adapter, so I can see, what it supports or what it does, but I can't really change anything. I'm just attaching it. So I'm going to go ahead and attach that one, and now I've got the two NICs. And you can change the order. You might have one that's more important than another. This is really important with standby adapters because it'll fail over to the first one in the list, and so you can use these up and down arrows to change which one is the primary adapter. If they're both active like this, it's not really going to matter which one is primary. One can fail to the other, it'll be fine. All right. Maybe we'll set this up for, well, we'll go both active. Why not? Okay. So, actually, hang on, I got to think. These are actually two separate. My physical interfaces are plugged into two different networks. So if I try and bring them both active, I'm probably going to lock myself out of this vCenter environment, because if it tries to send me to the second adapter and it's on a separate physical network, I'm going to be in trouble. So instead of adding it in as an active, let me add that in as a standby instead. So I'm going to use the arrows to move it down to standby. So VMNIC 0 is going to be active. This one will be standby, so I shouldn't hit it.
Don, do you have a scenario where you might want to use an unused adapter or select that? I mean, I know server hardware is so cheap, we just have extra network adapters laying around.
What it's really for is to reserve the adapter so that if another network admin comes in and they're configuring some other vSwitch, they don't steal the adapter from you. So you kind of stick it in unused and it just holds it. It might be that you're holding it for future use. It might be that you suspect it of being bad, and so you move it down to unused until you can run diagnostics on it and replace it. Those are some of the different reasons why you might use that. Yep. All right, so I'm going to leave it there as standby. You do have to be careful here. You could lock yourself out of the system if you're messing with the adapter that your management interface is on, and I am messing with that adapter, so I'm trying to be careful not to lock myself out, because that would be embarrassing. All right, so now I've attached that second adapter to my virtual switch. I don't see anything different though. When I look down here, I still just see VMNIC 0, and there's a few reasons why that can happen. The main reason being that typically the screen doesn't refresh. So I'm going to refresh it, and there we go. Now I see I've got two adapters. And see how one is orange and the other one is clear? That's because one is active and the other is standby. If I'd done both as active, they'd both be lit up right now, and I'd have those two adapters. All right. My virtual machines are now going to pass over this first one. Unless it fails, then they'll drop down to the second one. So I've got more than one physical adapter. And now when I edit the switch, I can edit the switch, I can go down to teaming and failover, And now I see the configuration settings here that I can adjust. I see that VMNIC1 is a standby. I could bump it up to active if I wanted, or I could even flop this one around. I could move them to where I needed them to be and get them set up the way that I want them to be set up. If I'm choosing to do load balancing, well, here I can tweak how load balancing works, and I can tweak how network failures are detected if I'm doing standby like I am right now. On the load balancing side, by default, it balances based on the originating virtual port. So basically, if I have 10 VMs, in theory, 5 end up on one adapter and 5 end up on the other, right? But you can change it to be based on source MAC address or IP. We can use explicit failover order where it goes round robin based on the order they're in. There's several different ways you can configure that based on your needs. But for most people, the originating virtual port is good enough. But if you've got one file server that you know has a ton of traffic and other ones that don't, you might not get true balancing. You might want to go to a dedicated interface for that file server versus all the other servers get lumped together. It's up to you how you want to configure that. With failure detection like I've got, it's set right now for link status only. If the network link on VMNIC 0 goes down, then it'll flip over to VMNIC 1. But as long as this link is up, VMNIC 0 will always stay up. The problem there is that means I've got layer 1 and layer 2 protection, but not necessarily layer 3. The route across that interface could go down, or the IP address could be bad, or something like that, and it's not going to stop. So you have other options like beacon probing. And with beacon probing, it'll actually send a communication across that line to make sure that it's truly working and not just rely on a link light. Because it's kind of funny, when you have an 8-wire connection for copper running in, there's actually only 2 wires in that bundle that are needed for the link light to come up. So all the other wires could be bad and you'd still have a link light. You can't always trust that. And so that's where we have the beacon probing, which helps. We actually send a communication to verify. It's a little more in depth. All right, but I'll stick with link status on mine for now. All right. You've also got notify switches. Now this is kind of an important one. When you fail over, all the MAC addresses for your virtual machines now jump over to another port, and your switch has to relearn that. Until your switch relearns it, it's going to be trying to send traffic over the other link, which isn't there. So if we say notify, as soon as we fail over, we immediately send messages so the switch learns those MAC addresses right away. It speeds up discovery, and so that's useful. That's turned on by default. And then failback. If the primary NIC dies and it jumps over to the backup, but then the primary NIC resumes, do we go back to the primary NIC? We may or may not want that because you can end up with flapping. Maybe the NIC is coming up and going down, coming up and going down, and you don't want to constantly be going back and forth. So you might want it to fail over and then require you to manually fail it back. You've got that option. All right. So I'm going to leave it set this way. Now I've got a nice little redundant environment. But I still have the problem of what I mentioned at the beginning of the show, which is technically both of these guys they're able to see each other. The virtual machine can see the management network and so on. So I might want to move this virtual machine off to a separate switch altogether, right? So I'm going to take VMNIC1 out of this switch. So I'm going to go back to managing my physical adapters. I'm going to take VMNIC1 and I'm just going to remove it. Okay. So I'm going to go back to the way we were, where I had one vSwitch with one adapter. No, refresh that time. Sometimes it refreshes. It's kind of finicky. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a completely separate switch. Now, normally it means I have to go and buy a switch, but here I don't, right? I can just go in and I can create a new switch. And so right up top, I can use add host networking. And you'll see you got a few different options like refreshing the networking and so on. I want to add a host network. And when I go to add a host network, it's going to ask me what I'm doing. And there's 3 different choices here. And I know Wes asked if there were different types of communications earlier in the show. There really aren't. Here I'm telling it basically what I intend to use the switch for, and it's basically putting some default settings in place. The configuration is actually the same. The technology is the same, but the way it's configured is different. So the first one is VM kernel network adapter. Am I trying to add another management interface? Well, why would I need more than one management interface? Well, some of these technologies, like vMotion can use a lot of bandwidth. vMotion lets us take a virtual machine that's running on one physical host and move it to another physical host and do it while it's on. And the way it does that is you've already got the hard drive synchronized between the 2 systems. It has to take what's in RAM on one and synchronize it with the RAM on the other one. And when the RAM is completely synchronized, then it can flip over to the other one. Well, if you've got 8 gigs of RAM on a virtual machine and it's very busy, RAM is constantly getting updated. So it has to slow the RAM down while it synchronizes it, get them in lockstep, and then flip over. The more bandwidth you have, the faster that'll happen. So I might want to have a dedicated vMotion adapter And so I can specify that here. I'll do a VM kernel, and then it'll ask me what I want to enable, right? So if I were to move forward on this, it's going to ask me to pick an existing switch if I want, or do a new switch, and then it'll ask me to pick which services I want, and I can choose just vMotion or just fiber channel over Ethernet or whatever it is that I'm trying to achieve. But the bottom two are the ones that we normally want: physical network adapter or virtual machine port group for a standard switch. Now, when I choose physical network adapter, what that's telling it is I want to add another physical adapter to the system. And I might be adding a physical adapter to the existing switch or creating a new switch with the physical adapter. That's what I want. Either way, it's creating a virtual machine port group, just like it says in the bottom option. The only difference is if I choose the bottom one, I can create a port group on a switch, on a new switch if I want, with no physical adapter. If there's no physical adapter, this is now isolated. So this would be like choosing an isolated network with those other vendors. Here I can create it just by not plugging in a physical adapter. So really, all three of these create a port group. It's just configured slightly different, and you can change it after the fact. If I create a port group with no physical adapter attached, it's isolated, I can always come and attach a physical adapter to it later, and all of a sudden it's external. Now it's attached to the LAN. So this is all easy to customize and change. I'm going to choose physical network adapter and move forward, and it's going to ask me what adapter I want to pick. Now, when I go and attach a physical adapter, it's asking, do I want to attach to an existing switch, or do I want to go to a new switch? I'm going to do a new switch. I want a completely separate switch because I'm trying to isolate traffic. I want my management on one interface, I want my VMs on another, right? So I'll do a new standard switch, and I'll hit next, and then it's going to ask me to pick my adapter. So, oh shoot, I've got to come in here and add my adapter. There we go. And so I'll add that one in as active. So there's my new VM-NIC1 being attached to this new switch, all shiny and new, and I'll go ahead and finish up. And so when I'm done, I'm going to see that I now have two vSwitches, vSwitch 0, vSwitch 1. vSwitch 0 has my management interface, and it has this VM network, and it's got the physical adapter for VM-NIC 0. If I choose vSwitch 1, here's the switch. It's got a physical adapter, and it's got no associated port groups. Nothing's attached to it. So I need to create a port group so that I can connect my hosts to it. All right, and I could do that by editing, or just clicking this link here, but I usually use a little wizard because it's a bit easier. If I go back to add host networking, this time I can choose, hey, I want to create a virtual machine port group. And now when I move forward, I can pick an existing switch, and I'm going to pick vSwitch 1, right? vSwitch 0 already has some stuff. I'm going to do vSwitch 1. And as I move forward, it's going to ask me to give it a name. And I'm going to call it my DMZ, right? These are going to be servers or workstations or whatever that are exposed to the internet, and I don't want them to communicate with my other VMs. And I definitely don't want them to communicate with management. I want these to be separate. Now, I could achieve the same goal through VLANs. If I had virtual local area networks, right? VLANs defined on my physical switches, we could tie into that. But if I'm trying to do it all internal here, I'm going to do it based on physical adapters. I'm separating it that way. So I don't need to mess with VLANs on this one. I'll show you a VLAN example here in a minute. And I can move forward and finish that up. And now what I'm going to see is that I've got a new port group that will appear any moment, ready to receive some virtual machines. So now that I've got that DMZ switch created, right, vSwitch 1, I just need to plug some stuff into it. So I'm going to go edit that web server, and we'll move it right into vSwitch 1. So let me just go back to my home screen here, and we're going to jump down to virtual machines and templates. And I'm going to find good old Web 01. We'll go into Manage, Settings, Virtual Machine Hardware. And I'm going to edit the virtual machine hardware for that machine. And once I get in here, I can take that network adapter right here, network adapter 1, and see how it shows is connected to VM network. And if I drop that down, I see all of my networks. And I can choose DMZ. And so now I'm going to plug it right into the DMZ. I'll hit OK on that. And as soon as that updates, if I watch my recent tasks down here, I'll see it's kind of working. It should happen pretty quick. It did. And as soon as it's done, it'll show us plugged into DMZ. And I can go verify that by jumping back to my host and going into my host networking. And when I take a look at vSwitch 1, vSwitch 1 now shows as having one physical adapter, and inside of it, there's Web 01 plugged right into it. Okay, so Web 01 is now plugged in effectively to a switch that's connected to VM-NIC1. So if VM-NIC1 is plugged into my physical DMZ, this virtual machine and any other virtual machine I add to it is also plugged into that DMZ. All right. Now, let's pretend for a moment that Web 01 isn't a web server. What if it's a software firewall or a proxy server, a gateway of some sort, and I want it to be plugged into the DMZ and my internal network? Well, a virtual machine can actually be plugged into more than one network. It can be plugged into more than one port group on the same switch, or it can be plugged into two completely different switches. And the way we do it is just like in real life. In real life, if I have a server and I want to plug it into two different switches, what do I need? I need two different network cards, right? So I can always add another network card to this virtual machine and then plug it into a second switch. Think of these vSwitches as real switches. It's just like a real switch, all right? So I'm going to go and take that virtual machine, Web 01, and I'm going to edit its hardware again. And, oh, I might actually have to shut it down. Let me see if it'll let me do this live. Some OSs will let you add a network. Think real life, okay? If in real life you want to add another network adapter to your server, what do you have to do? You know, shut it down, add the adapter, right? So it might complain at me, but we'll see what we can do here. So I'll do, I'm going to add a network adapter, and I'll add that one in. And when I add that new network adapter, it asks me what network do I want it to be on. I'm going to add it to the VM network. So now I'm going to have my first adapter attached to DMZ, my second adapter attached to VM network, right? And so when I say OK to that, it's going to plug that thing in, or it's going to crash, one or the other. And then we'll end up with two adapters plugged into two switches. And if I jump back to my host, back to my networking, and back to my vSwitches, and I take a look at my pictures, I'm going to hit my old refresh button just to make sure this is clean. And we take a look at our pictures. Now when I look down here at the bottom, I can see here's my default vSwitch 0, which has my management network, and it's got virtual machine 0. Ah, shoot, it is going to make me reboot. So the virtual machine isn't seeing that new adapter. Let me just refresh one more time. Maybe I'm being impatient. I did kind of move fast there. So yeah, it's not going to refresh for me. So I'll need to restart that that virtual machine to recognize the adapter. But it'll show it as being plugged in here, and it'll be plugged into the other switch. So kind of nice that we have that functionality there. And I'm just going to, let's reset that thing. And so we'll let it reset. And once it reboots, then it'll recognize that second adapter and connect properly. So we'll give it a moment while it's doing that. Now, while it's doing that, let me show you a little bit about that VM kernel adapter, and then I think that's about the last I have for this episode. If I go back to my host networking, and I take vSwitch 0 and look at that kernel adapter, right? That VM kernel port, that's my management interface. And right up here, I can see my VM kernel adapters, and I've only got one. You can add more than one if you want to dedicate it for different services. And if you edit that VM kernel adapter, we're going to see all the different services. The one created by default is just for management traffic, and you probably don't want to mess with it. The reason is if you break it, now you don't have a way to connect, right? I mean, you're not completely out of luck. If you go to the console of an ESX host right here, in the console, if you jump into, if you press F2, you can get into your customize screen, and there we go. And when you get into your customize screen, you'll see some of the different options, one of which is configure management network. So if I get completely locked out, I can go up to the console of the machine, and I can restart the management network, test the management network adapters, and configure the management network, so I can always put it back. So if you really lock yourself out, you just need physical access to the box and you can fix it, right? But you don't want to have to do that. For example, what if you put this thing in lockdown mode? Well, now you can't get to this screen that I'm on right now. You've got to configure it from vCenter, but you just locked yourself out of vCenter. Now you out of luck. Now you're kind of screwed, right? So you don't want that, right? So definitely be careful to make sure you don't lock yourself out of these things. So leave this one alone, but you can create more VM kernel adapters. So you might want to have a dedicated one for vMotion. I do that all the time. If you want the best failover, dedicated adapters for that. Dedicated adapters for storage, like virtual SAN traffic, really handy to have. Get your best optimization. You might want to use jumbo frames on your virtual SAN network and not use jumbo frames on the rest. So you have separate VM kernel adapters for each, so you can start to specify that. So those are all different things we can do there. All right, let's see if our virtual machine has sorted itself out. So I'm just taking a look at Web 01. It does show its two interfaces as connected. I'm going to go back to my host and networking, and I'm going to take a look at my switches, and I'm going to force a refresh just because I can. And eventually my picture will come back up, or Have I broken the rules here? It's not going to show me a picture anymore. It's getting mad at me. All right, well, here I can see my DMZ switch, and I still see Web 01 is plugged right there into my DMZ switch. And vSwitch 0, there we go. That's what I was trying to get this whole time. I can see I've got that one physical adapter, and I can see virtual machines 1. And I expanded and it disappeared again. But that machine is plugged in there, I promise you. I mean, we see it right here from the machine. You can be connected to more than one switch. You can actually have more than one connection to the same switch. So for example, I could edit this and make both of those DMC adapters, right? If I wanted, I could do that. There's not a lot of reason to do that. Normally you do it for like load balancing or performance, but these are virtual adapters anyway, so you're not going to get any better performance out of 2 than you would out of 1. They're plugged into the same virtual switch, so not a lot of call to do that. But once it's there, it'll be in place and off you go. Now, everything we've seen so far has been what's called a vSwitch. And you guys see they're pretty powerful. We can do a lot of stuff with these things, and they're very effective. You'll work with them a lot. Except vSwitches are really only useful if you have standalone ESXi boxes. If I have multiple ESXi boxes clustered together for things like vMotion, I need to have a VM like my web server here, where it can fail over from one physical host to another physical host. Well, where does this vSwitch exist? The vSwitch exists, in my case, on ESX host 01. On ESX host 02, if I go to networking, I don't have a vSwitch 1. So if my web server fails over to ESX host 02, it has no network connection. So what's the point in failing it over? It's offline. So vSwitches are only useful in standalone environments. That's a pretty big limitation to them, right? So you might use vSwitches in a small company, but in a large company, it's a rare day you use vSwitches. Instead, you use what are called distributed virtual switches, or DV switches. DV switches don't exist on one host. They exist on all the hosts in a cluster. So if I have a cluster of 16 ESXi hosts, I could have one DV switch that spanned all of them. And now, if my web server failed over from host to host to host, it would always have that network present. So medium, large environments, you're almost always going to use distributed vSwitches, which are what we're going to see in the next episode.
A lot of great information there on networking, Don, and I am looking at the clock here. It does look like we're flexing the muscles on the clock here. Also, more importantly, I don't know if we want to wrap this up before Don strangles Flash on us there.
I know.
But before we do, Don, do you have any parting words?
Main thing is vSwitches are really useful. It's easy enough to change them around. You just think of them as physical switches because they work exactly like physical switches do, and they're pretty cut and dry. Be careful with the management VM kernel adapter because you can lock yourself out of the box, especially if you have lockdown mode turned on. In fact, what I usually recommend is turn off lockdown mode on the host while you're configuring these adapters. And only once you get it all done do you turn lockdown mode back on, just to save you the trouble of getting locked out of your own host.
Well, Don, we appreciate having you in the studios as always, and we appreciate you, the viewer watching. Signing out for IT Pro TV, I've been your host, Wes Bryan.
And I'm Don Pizzette.
And we'll see you next time.